Surveys. It's working. Okay, let's hope that this doesn't. Video that I did had a little bit of technical problems. Hopefully this one will not. All right, so we are after afternoon, so I can say good afternoon. And I heard that there was a little discussion about which Torah portion it is. What did we finally settle on being the Torah portion? Yitro. And Yitro is one of only two Torah portions that is named for somebody that's not Jewish. Balak, which is the king who hires Bilam, and the parasha in which he is, and Yitro. So Yitro is not Jewish, or is he? Well, who is Yitro? Jethro in English, and we're not talking about the Beverly Hillbilly.
High priest of Midian.
What's that? The high priest of Midian. Okay.
And he's Moses' father-in-law.
And he's Moses' father-in-law.
Right.
All right, so let's do a little bit of a recap of the story of Moses so that we understand, because Yitro is going to come storming into the beginning of our parasha and is going to be the focus of our discussion. So we need to make sure we have the backstory a little bit down. So Moses was 40. The first organizational psychologist. But before we get to his psychological insights, so Moses was 40 years old when he finally fled the land of Egypt. And when he flees the land of Egypt, he comes to Midyan. Midyan is on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula. It is probably in the area of northern Saudi Arabia, that sort of zone. And when he is there, he meets this woman named Zipporah by a well, which, yes, is continuing the classic trope of meeting your women by the well. And, well, they didn't have nightclubs. What do you want?
The local watering hole.
The local watering hole, quite literally. He does good service, and her father starts talking about marriage, and bam, 40 years later, he's been married to Zipporah for 40 years. And that's when God then sends him back to the land of Egypt in order to bring him out. So it's a reminder that before you're 80, you haven't even accomplished anything, because that's when Moses started actually redeeming an entire nation. It's way to go, 80-year-olds. Octogenarians are quite capable. But so we know then that Yitro, Jethro, is Moses' father-in-law, is the father of Zipporah, Moses' wife. We're all good with that then? Good. He is also described in the text as Cohen Midyan, that he is a Cohen, or is the Cohen of Midyan. And Cohen, well, usually we think of Cohen, we think of, Mr. Cohen, who's, we think of Cohen as being a Jewish name. But Cohen is a more general term than that, which we will have to grapple with.
We also encounter that name with Melchizedek.
We see the word Cohen in a number of places that have no obvious connection to Judaism. Right.
This is before there's any Jewish priesthood.
Right. So the word Cohen, even though it's become a proper Jewish name, seems to have been a more generic term in ancient times. And we will wrestle with what that generic term might or might not have meant. But now, with that in mind, Moses, who has been gone for at least a year, has finally led the people out of Egypt, and they have arrived at the base of what is going to be known as Mount Sinai. And when they're there, here comes Yitro. Here comes Jethro to greet him. Everyone with us so far then on the story as the curtain lifts and what's about to happen? All right, so we are going to begin right with the beginning, 432. This is chapter 18 of the book of Exodus, page 432. Do I have a volunteer? I have a volunteer.
Jethro, priest of Midyan, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out from Egypt. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent home, and her two sons, one of whom was named Gershom, that is to say, Gershom, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And the other was named Eliezer, meaning, the God of my father was my help, and he delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh.
Which is quite a lot to pack into a small name.
Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' sons and wife to him in the wilderness. where he was encamped at the mountain of God.
All right, so pause there. That's a lot to unpack of what's going on here. So, what do we mean so? So just take it for a second on line 2, right? We were introduced to this character, reintroduced to the character of Yitro in verse 1. And we hear that he is still a Cohen of Midyan, that he is a priest, as our translation gives it, of Midyan, and that he had heard what God had done. Verse 2 begins with the wonderful word so.
Which in Hebrew?
There is no word in this verse that is so.
So.
Right, this is a translator trying to help us stitch together Hebrew verses that expect you, the reader, to do the stitching on your own. So here, the implication of the word so by the translator seems to be that if these things hadn't happened, that he wouldn't have brought the family with him. It's a little ambiguous of exactly why the translator felt the need for the word so. It could have just as easily read, he had heard how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after It could have continued without the so, without trying to put that linkage of causality, which is so easy to slip in, as I've done a few times if you've been paying attention. But it is so easy to slip in, but not so easy to get rid of once you have gotten it into your mind that that's what it means. So see, I've been trying to pepper them in just to see if you're paying attention. And then we get a little description about Moses' sons, Gershom and Eliezer. And then we find out that not only is Jethro coming to visit Moses, but that he's bringing the family.
Since the Torah doesn't use words, overuse words, why does it mention 3 times that he's the father?
I want to make sure you put that.
All right. So why continually give him the title over and over again, father-in-law, father-in-law, and father-in-law? I mean, is that really the most important title about Yitro? I would have thought Cohen Midyan, the Cohen of Midyan, would be the more important title. That's certainly probably what you would expect to have him put on his resume, rather than father-in-law of some guy. But the Torah has a different perspective, right? Why is Yitro important to this story? Because he's related to Moses, right? Because he's the father-in-law of Moses. If he wasn't the father-in-law of Moses, he would not be getting this amount of screen time. If he was just, in quotes, the Cohen of Midyan, then yeah, he's a guy and he's got an important job in some other country. But he wouldn't figure into our narrative so prominently. There is another reason as well, which is his father-in-law-ness to Moses implies that he is the father of Moses's wife. And this is a very important reminder, of his relationship to his daughter and the relationship between father-in-law and son-in-law, but also a reminder of Moses's wife not being from among the children of Israel who were in Egypt. Right? Zipporah was not born in Egypt. She was not born among the Israelites. She was an outsider by every classical usage of the term. All right, I saw a hand. Yes?
No, I was just going to comment on the fact that they really push the family tie, because it would have also looked very strange if he was taking advice, this kind of organizational advice and personal kind of advice from the priest of Midyan.
All right, so let me just make sure everybody understands when we keep talking about organizational advice. If you haven't read the Torah portion yet this week, or you don't quite remember all the details, Jethro is going to watch Moses leading the people, and he's going to watch him sitting from morning all the way till night, answering all the people's questions and judging all the people's cases. And he's going to say, you are going to burn yourself out. Right? You cannot be one man with this many thousands and thousands and thousands of people. It just doesn't work like that. You need to divide it into different groups and have each group have a leader, and then the subgroups, each of those subgroups have a leader, and then subgroups, and each of those subgroups have a leader, so that there's a hierarchy. And you only get the questions at the very, very top that no one else at the lower level can handle. That way, we got some extra chairs here, guys. Just pull them around, find a place, make yourself comfortable. It's good that we should be cramped. There are extra copies of the Chumashim under at the bottom of the bookshelf. And so that is what is being referred to when we keep talking about the advice of organizational realignment, that yes, it might be a little strange if he was just consulting with some other random leader of another group, but the fact that he has a father-in-law gives him an excuse of why he might take his advice.
Let's get back to him marrying outside the tribe of Israel. Though. He really didn't have the chance to marry within the tribe of Israel, did he? Since
Oh, no,
he
but
was
that is definitely not that he looked at all the Israelite girls and said, none here for me, let's go to Midian.
Yeah.
He was driven out of Egypt because of fear for his life after he, killed the Egyptian kind of accidentally on purpose.
Taskmaster.
Exactly, who definitely deserved to be stopped. And so that's kind of where we end up with him having to flee. So yeah, it's not like he had a choice of, in quote, a nice Jewish girl. It very much was the needs of the time.
This thing about Zipporah, his wife had been sent home, and then her father took her. I mean, first place, she was sent away because he was taking the people out of Israel.
Exactly. Right.
She was sent away someplace, and then, well, where would he send her if he wasn't going to send her to her father?
Exactly. This wasn't like you could just put her in the local Ramada and have her wait there while he did the whole Exodus thing. So she returned to her father's home, waiting to see whether her husband would be able to stand toe-to-toe with Pharaoh and the greatest empire in the area, which apparently he could. But that must have been a little dicey. And then having succeeded, now we can sort of understand why the translator uses the word so. Having succeeded, when Yitro hears about that, he now knows it is safe to meet him, to bring the family to him. Rather than waiting for Moses to arrive all the way in Midyan with this giant group of people, it's much, much faster for Yitro to jump on the camel and just get there, because a few people travel much faster than thousands and thousands. So a few more comments?
Yeah, but Zipporah, she hadn't left Midian. Moses left, and he left his family behind. Is that not right?
Correct. There's a little bit of ambiguity of where they were when Moses got the call at the burning bush and when he finally took off, whether they were in Mount Sinai itself, which is somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula, which is further afield from Midian, or whether they were closer to Midian and all of that. That gets debated. So she may not have been down the street from her dad, but she still was a lot closer to him than they were to Egypt. Right, exactly. Okay, let's keep rolling and find out what's going to happen here.
We're in verse 6. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him.
And there, thankfully, they kept the pronouns as ambiguous as they should be. Who is bowing to whom? We don't know. It could be that Yitro is bowing to Moses. It could be that Moses is bowing to Yitro. And commentators do like to argue about that.
Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent. Moses then recounted to his father-in-law everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had befallen them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced over all the kindness that the Lord had shown Israel when he delivered them from the Egyptians.
But what? He's getting happy because our God did good stuff for us? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, depends on your worldview.
Yeah.
Right? If your worldview is there is, the pocket of Israel and there is the pocket of Midyan, and there is the God of Israel, we'll call it God I, and then there is the God of Midyan, and boom, that is a hard, bright line. Then if Israel has good, what does Midyan care?
They're going to assimilate.
But there's the right relationship, father-in-law.
Okay,
That's where this comes in.
but we are knowing that at least with these 2 people, that there is a relationship that comes across. So maybe that Yitro is just happy that his son-in-law didn't get killed, and that his son-in-law's people have been saved, which, because you're my son-in-law, your people are important to you, you're important to me, therefore I'm happy if you're happy. So there is some of that. On the other hand, it could also be a question of where exactly is Jethro, right? Is he still a full-fledged servant of the God of Midian, or gods of Midian, or is he saying, you know what? This God that you're following kind of impressive. That's something we're going to have to unpack and wrestle with. All right, a little bit more.
Blessed be the Lord, Jethro said, who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. Yes, by the result of their very schemes against the people.
Very interesting sentence. All right, what is he saying?
He said that he knows that your God is greater than all gods.
Okay, but which all gods?
My God.
That his gods.
All right, so one interpretation is that the God of the Israelites has to be, greater than the God of Midian. However, by the second half of the verse, when he's talking about the schemes, the plans, the things that were done against Israel, he may be introducing another group, which is Egypt and the gods of Egypt. Because those are the ones that were attacking Israel. And when God brought us out of Egypt, it may have been the gods of Egypt that were getting the humiliating treatment. And Pharaoh, of course, who considered himself a god in the bargain. So it may be that Jethro was saying the God of Israel is greater than every god, or it may be that Jethro was saying the God of Israel is greater than the Egyptian gods and isn't making any specific reference to the gods of which he has been a part of. It's unclear. The ambiguity should be something good and something we can sit with and not feel anxious about. That ambiguity is what allows the text to speak in different levels and different ways.
And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to take part of the meal before God with Moses' father-in-law.
All right, so Jethro brings a sacrifice. The sacrifice is offered, and it's not only eaten by Jethro, which was normal that the person who brought the sacrifice would eat the meat, but he offers and is joined by the elders and other leaders of the people of Israel. Okay, so what do we think? Jethro, good guy?
Good guy.
Yeah.
Seems to be pretty good, right? It's everyone should have a father-in-law who is so supportive.
Just ask my son-in-law.
Isn't Midian considered to have been kind of a wealthy, powerful, because of the copper mines and the grass and the.
So Midyan was in a very good commercial location. So it had a lot of trade routes going through it between the rest of Asia and Egypt. It also had the copper mines. It was also important, I believe, in the spice trade. Midyan was not bad. So we should think of Jethro as being a successful guy, he wasn't just a poor shepherd. He was somebody.
He was a somebody.
And he was part of a nation that was somebody's. They weren't Egypt, but they weren't insignificant.
In Midian, did they have idolatry?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That was.
Yep, lock, stock, and barrel. They were wonderfully idolatrous. But so were all the nations back then.
You didn't have a statue of your own.
No, I mean there wasn't a single nation in this whole. I'm pointing as though this is a map. In this whole region of the ancient Near East, there wasn't a single nation that wasn't anything but idolatrous.
Sure.
And really, at this point, I'd have to go back and double check to find any possible exceptions. But I think I can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that pretty much every human being on Earth had some version of idolatry as their standard form. Even if they were semi-monotheistic in terms of limiting their worship to only one God, they still worship that God through idolatry, through statues and icons and imagery. The idea that you would not build a statue to your God had not caught on anywhere else in this time. Good?
Right, but were their gods different than the Egyptians?
Yes,
Yes, they had their own.
Yes, the classic motif in the ancient world was every nation had their own gods. And some of them would overlap. That is to say that the Canaanite gods and the Sumerian gods and the Assyrian gods, there were often striking similarities, and sometimes the names would be changed only mildly between one country and the other, just a little bit of a tweak here and there. And many of the stories would be the same. But each nation still usually would have something that was unique to themselves, that was their national god or that was special to themselves, yes. And that was also because most of the ancient gods were believed to be attached to particular regions. Gods were very territorial in the ancient world. Gods were the gods of the Nile. It wasn't the god of rivers everywhere. It was the god of these rivers within this territory. And when you left that territory, you wouldn't expect that god to have any influence. That was one reason why the whole revolution of the Israelite religion was kind of shocking, with Israel saying, no, actually our God is able to be over the gods of Egypt and over the god of Midyan and over the gods of everybody else, because there is really only one God. And even when our people are outside their land, their God is still with them. And even when our people lose, their God is still with them. That was also quite a shocking notion. All right, so let's get into who our tradition has felt this gentleman Yitro is. So we're on the page that begins where Rabbi Eliezer said.
Rabbi Eliezer said, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, I am the one who spoke and brought the world into existence. I am the one who brings close, not who pushes away. I brought Yitro close, and I did not push him away. So you also, when a person comes to you to convert and comes for the sake of heaven, you should bring him close and not push him away.
Okay, so it's a major statement, yes, from the Mechilta, one of the earliest strains of rabbinic midrash from 2,000 plus years ago. So it's a very strong statement in support of, if someone comes with an authentic desire to be Jewish, we bring them close, we don't push them away. I know that many people have in their mind the idea that you're supposed to push someone away 3 times, blah, 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 blah. That became a convention and practice when we lived among nations that would murder us if we converted anyone, right? So we started saying no, more and more, because when we said yes, if the local leaders found out that we were converting Christians or Muslims to Judaism, the entire town could be killed. And so generally speaking, we said we probably shouldn't be converting because we don't have to, right? Judaism does believe that a righteous person of any nation can be a righteous person and have a share in every life and this life and the next life. So we didn't have an overarching need to convert the whole world, but also it just seemed like a pretty good survival tactic not to get murdered for doing so. However, the Mechilta was written long before that became the political reality. And the spiritual reality that it remembers is the idea that if someone genuinely wants to serve God, roofers, we should be glad that they have come, and we should welcome them with open arms. And they're using Yitro as an example, right? Now, why is he the example? Well, look at what he does here, right? What are his statements? He proclaims that God is God. He proclaims that God is greater than all gods. He recognizes the miracles of what God has done. He only heard all of this. Notice how that was emphasized at the very beginning. The Israelites had seen it all, and they doubted. He heard about it, and yet he believed.
So he heard and believed,
which is a higher level of faith than the person who saw and doubted. And then what does he do? He wants to bring a sacrifice. Right. We haven't heard about any of the other Israelites ever since we finished our Passover sacrifice, offering a sacrifice in celebration for what God has done. And yet here, bam, Yitro shows up and says, this is so amazing. I've got to get in on this. Let me offer a sacrifice as well. So the tradition that the Mechilta represents is one where Yitro is the prototypical convert. He is somebody who has heard about God's greatness and wants to join the game. And he does so by praising God, by accepting God, and by offering a sacrifice, showing that he is willing to worship in our way. You closing the door for us? Thank you. On the plus side, like I said, when the roof is done, we won't have drips.
That raises the question of who is really a Jew. Mm-hmm. And it's being, debated if it is a DNA related.
It is not DNA related.
It is not DNA related. So
right. that actually is not debated among Jews. And among non-Jews, they like to talk about our DNA. We never do.
And then if a soul gravitates to the Torah and the commandments, there must be something in the DNA of that soul.
In the DNA of a soul, but the soul's DNA has nothing to do with the ribonucleic acid, right?
Spiritually speaking, there must be something in that soul, because some people
spiritually
really
speaking,
seek it with that determined,
Right. Spiritually speaking, yes, people will resonate with Judaism in ways that are incredibly strong and powerful. It's the smell of the roofing
It's-
materials.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I know.
Tar.
I know.
Can I ask a
I
question
think
on
we
that
all
line?
are open.
Like,
Well-
what about like as being the light of the world, the children of God?
Right. So the idea of being, so the idea of us being the Or Lagoyim, the light to the nations, is understood in different ways, right? Judaism generally doesn't think that means that we should shine our light on everyone and make them Jewish, but rather we should be holding aloft a light so that everyone else can see more clearly the right path to live in their own way. Right, so it's sort of like somebody with a lantern, right? Holding a lantern up means that other people can say, "Oh, okay, this is the direction I should go," or a lighthouse motif, if you will. Stay away from the bad rocks and don't crash your boat. It doesn't mean that everyone has to become part of the lighthouse. It just means they should use the wisdom that Judaism has to also guide them in their own way. So that's why Judaism has never felt the need to make people Jewish, or even to encourage people to be Jewish. But as you see from Mechilta, when someone wants to be Jewish, the idea should be, great, welcome. Right? You don't see Moses saying, "Oh, no, sorry. Sacrifices are only for us. Thank you for bringing my wife and kids. Get out." He does very much the opposite.
What I had understood was that Hashem is our God, and He shows the whole world that He and Him alone is God. That's
That
what
so the idea that God is God, that God is the only God, is a different statement than the idea that Judaism is the only path.
Okay.
Right? God being the God of the whole world doesn't mean that Judaism is the religion of the whole world.
Okay.
Judaism is a way, a very nice way, I have to admit, of reaching God, and the way that is most suitable for Jews to reach towards God. But for other people of the world, some may resonate and be attracted to Judaism and want to join, at which point we should welcome them with open arms. Others may seek God using the ideas, the wisdom of Judaism has, of the idea of there being only one God, of not making statues and doing those types of things. But that doesn't mean that they would necessarily keep kosher or keep Passover or do Sukkot or the other uniquely Jewish activities.
I have one question.
Only one.
What does it mean? I have heard from some rabbis from Israel, even rabbis from Israel, that the Torah is not to be taught to the other nations, and that it prohibits the Goyim to learn Torah. And if a soul wants to learn Torah, God wants this to be known by all humankind.
Yeah,
Why do they say that? What do they say?
I can't speak for them because without having heard their teachings directly, I can't comment on their teachings. I can say generically that there are some rabbis that I have encountered their teachings that make what I believe false analogy or false conclusion. Right? So yes, Judaism does believe that if somebody wants to be Jewish, they should become Jewish. They shouldn't act Jewish. They shouldn't study Torah on their own. They shouldn't begin doing Jewish observance on their own and not be part of the community. If someone wants to be Jewish, join us. Don't just, be pseudo-Jewish and make your own path, which unfortunately there are thousands and thousands of people who do, and the internet is full of them, and they are full of it. But these people who try to invent their own Judaism often have latent anti-Semitism, that they don't want to be Jewish because they don't actually like Jews, but they like this because they think it makes them more authentic. And that is a huge problem and very misleading. And indeed, one of the underlying causes of the Messianic movement in the States and other parts of the world as well, the pseudo-Jewish Messianic movement that accepts Jesus as their Messiah, and all of that other Narishkeit, right? That is a huge problem. That is a huge problem. Unfortunately, because of that problem, some rabbis say not only should they not adopt Judaism on their own, we shouldn't even let them study it, which I believe is a big problem. Because if someone wants to learn Judaism, if someone wants to learn the way we study Torah, the way we do our faith and our service of God, then absolutely they should be welcome and come in. They don't get to call themselves Jewish just because they are studying Torah. They don't get to follow the commandments yet because they are not bound by them until they officially convert. But this wisdom is meant to be accessible by everyone. It's a matter of understanding what the demarcation is, who is in which group. Again, not trying to be chauvinistic, which unfortunately some people are. And I have even heard some rabbis who are very sort of Jewish nationalist, unfortunately. But just to simply say, there is a path for Judaism and for the Jewish people, and there is a path for others, and we are all pointing to the same place, but we do walk our own paths. So that's the short answer to a very complicated and difficult. If you ever have a link to a particular rabbi that has said something that has confused you, send it along, and I'll be able to try and analyze what that rabbi said. Okay, onward. So let's get back to Yitro.
Rav Alazar Hamadai says, he, Yitro, was an officer, as in Samuel, and the sons of David were Kohanim.
Right. So what does the word Cohen mean? So he takes the word Cohen to mean officer, right? To be a muckety muck, right? Somebody that was important in the overall hierarchy of Midyan, rather than necessarily being a priest. Now, why would you want that particular analysis? Because it then spares Yitro of being an idolater, right? He wasn't serving the gods of Midyan, right? He was just, a leader of Midyan. And so therefore separating. And he brings by way of example, the idea from the book of Samuel, where we hear about David's sons also being called Kohanim. We know for a fact they were not Kohanim the way we mean the word Kohanim, because David being from the tribe of Judah, there's no way his sons were from the tribe of Levi, let alone descended from Aaron. So the word Kohen clearly does have a linguistic range to it that can include non-priestly duties.
The Art Scroll translation deals with that by saying he's a minister.
What a wonderful English word to cover both versions in our text. Okay. However, not universal.
Now, the chief of Midian, the most prominent among them.
Right. So he takes it as the word chief rather than being priest. And they say, what does Cohen mean? It means prominent.
He had abandoned idolatry, so they banned him from living with them. From Exodus Rabbah, and drove them, the daughters, away because of the ban.
All right. So now we get a question of, if he is a muckety muck, or if he is a priest of Midyan, what's he doing traveling out here, right, away from his people? He should be at home serving. But the idea being that he has rejected idolatry at this point in the story, and therefore he has been excommunicated from Midyan. They have kicked him out of the country, and his children as well have been kicked out of the country because of his father. And so now he is traveling to Moses because he's got nowhere else to go. And that is a bit of an issue for him and his family. And one that we'll see on the back page explains another interesting little tidbit of the descendants of Yitro. All right. On the other hand,
Kohen, which means priest in biblical Hebrew, can refer to one who serves any god, false or true. However, Yitro was a priest of the true God.
All right, so Ibn Ezra, in his normal style, wants to give a straightforward explanation, but he also wants to preserve something special about Yitro. So straightforwardly, he was a priest, right? Because the word Cohen, just like the word priest in English, can mean a priest of a true God. It can also mean a priest of, some devil god. So sure, it's just a priest. However, he wants to preserve the idea that Yitro was a priest of Adonai, that he wasn't a priest of the Midianite gods anymore, that his status was now directed only towards our God, our GI.
Yeah. After Yitro converted to Judaism, he was called Chovav, as we see in Judges.
Right, so we do get another reference to Moses' father-in-law in the book of Judges, and there he is not called Yitro, he is called Chovav.
And we know that it's the same person they're talking about.
It definitely calls him Moses' father-in-law. So presumably, and this is a little debate in some circles, but generally accepted, presumably he only had one father-in-law, and therefore he let same person, two different names. And as we're going to see, Ramban gives a good explanation why.
Because it is the way of all converts to call themselves a different name when they become Jews.
Right, so especially in the classical world, when people had a name that was only used within their community, once you converted, you used the name that you had converted to use. You didn't use your original name. Nowadays, when we have multi-layers to a community where we can have an English name and a Hebrew name, it's normal for people to keep using both. But in the ancient world, people didn't have those kinds of layers. The community was monolithic, and therefore you would use the name that you had now gained by converting.
Okay. Does that have anything to do with Superman? Because he was Kal-El, then he comes to Earth and Clark Kent.
Interesting question. I am not quite up on my Superman commentary, but I do know that the author of Superman was Jewish, and that there are certain elements of his backstory that are Jewish elements.
The reverse.
But I don't think that we would call him a convert then, because
It'd be the reverse. Of
Yeah. Exactly. He was trying to blend in with the world, which of course is also the whole Clark Kent thing. All right, so that's okay. It's an interesting pop culture digression.
Yeah.
Let's get back to his reaction, though.
Yitro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard. What had he heard that made him come and convert? Rabbi Joshua says, he heard about the war of Amalek and came, as it is written in the immediately prior passage.
All right, so again, for those of you that are less comfortable using the Eitz Chaim, you may not realize that from the page before, which looks like it's this really long song part of the story of Deborah, it's not actually what came before. You need to flip back all the way to page 422 to find out immediately what happened in chapter 17. And if you read that and the few verses ahead of that, the very end of chapter 17, you'll find the last thing that happened before Jethro showed up wasn't the story of Deborah, but the last thing that happened before Jethro showed up was the story of Amalek, was the story of the Amalekites attacking the Israelites as they had left Egypt and attacking the weak and the helpless in their great act of cruelty. So,
And Moses built a slaughter site or altar, and now Yitro brings something for that.
right. So the idea being that this is just a continuation. So Rabbi Joshua is saying that you can tell something about what's going on by which portion came next to which portion. The juxtaposition matters. That's not universally agreed upon, however. Now, there is an underlying message that is very interesting, that if you take this as being right after the Amalekites, then the Torah is trying to tell us something very important by saying that there are Amalekites in the world and there are Jethros in the world, right? There are some people out there that are horrible, mean, and cruel, and there are some people out there that are like Jethro, which are amazing, kind, and very wise and open. So you shouldn't think that everybody outside of your community is all Amalekites, and you also shouldn't be so naive to think everybody outside your community are all Jethros. You have to judge each group and each people, each person on their own merits. But Rabbi Eliezer, he disagrees.
He says,
Rabbi Elazar Hamodai,
Yitro heard about the giving of the Torah and therefore came along. When the Holy One, blessed be he, revealed the Torah to Israel, the sound echoed from one end of the earth to the other, and all the kings shook in their palaces.
Okay, so pause for a moment, and now do the timeline.
Yeah.
He came after he heard about the giving of the Torah.
No,
What chapter is the Torah given in?
wait,
The Ten Commandments?
it's long past. There is that.
Chapter 20.
Right.
What chapter are we in right now?
18.
Wait a minute. That would seem to imply that Rabbi Elazar Hamodai doesn't know what order things happen in the Torah. However, there is, as I just mentioned before, a principle that just because one thing happened before another in the Torah doesn't mean that's what happened before the other in the timeline. That the Torah sometimes writes things out of order chronologically for other purposes, because the Torah is not writing a journalistic account of the events. It is trying to draw our attention to meaning. And why might you write the story of Jethro showing up after the event that sparked him coming? Because by doing so, you juxtapose him with Amalek, as I just mentioned, and now we have a very interesting lesson about the different types of people in the world that would have been lost if we had gone from the Amalekites straight into the giving of the Torah and then Jethro showing up. Now, why might we also assume that Jethro showed up after the Torah was given? Because, as we talked about, he is about to give advice on how to adjudicate laws. Prior to the Torah being given, which laws were being handled? Right? If you don't have a law code, you don't need judges. And so the idea that he showed up after the Torah was given is fairly popular among many of the ancient commentaries, that we're reading this slightly out of order for other reasons. Okay, so that it still makes perfect sense then to say that he came because he had heard of the giving of the Torah, and that the idea that when the Torah was given, the whole world shook, because this was a turning point in the world, that now we have a guide of how to live a good and proper life, and that is something good, not just for us, but for the world. Onward.
So back in verse 11, it said, now I know, Yitro said, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. When it says, now I know, it doesn't mean that before then Yitro didn't know God. If that were the case, it would have been forbidden for Moses to marry his offspring. Rather, it means he didn't know that God punishes the oppressor with the same measure with which he oppressed.
Right? So it couldn't say, according to Rav Sadia Gaon, from the great Gaonic period, he couldn't say that that meant he didn't know God, because if he didn't know God, then what was Moses doing marrying an idolater? Right? That just doesn't make sense. So therefore, he must have known God and must have been therefore on the outs, as we talked about with the rest of Midyan. And that explains why Tzipporah was willing to marry Moses and why they were able to raise children that were within the Jewish faith. However, then we have to work out what he did learn when he says, now I know. And the idea being that he now understood midah keneged midah, that it's measure against measure. Right. Just as they threw us, our children, into the river, so too will the sea, so too will they be thrown into the sea. That as they oppressed us, so will they be punished. That there will be a poetic justice, to use the modern English phrase. Okay, and now we're going to get one more little twist of the nose that is incredibly rude.
Zimri took Cozbi.
All right, who are these people?
Zimri, Cozbi.
Okay, all the way near the end of the book of Bamidbar, we have the story of the Israelites engaging in acts of carnal pleasure with some other ladies who happen to come from Midyan. And in doing so, they are joining in their idolatrous practice. Right? There is a whole assembly of these women that are being used deliberately to seduce the men of Israel towards their idolatry. As that's going on, there is one very famous case between Zimri and Cozbi, who are getting it on, to use the kids' vernacular, right in the middle of the camp. It's not even like in a tent or behind a bush somewhere. They are smack middle of the camp. And that is the phrase that's being discussed.
So Zimri took Cozbi by her forelock and brought her to Moses.
Right, so he's literally dragging this girl who he's about to be with here publicly by her hair and holding her up in front of Moses tauntingly.
And he said to Moses, Ben Amram, is this woman forbidden or permitted? And if you should rule that she is forbidden, as to the daughter of Yitro, who permitted you to marry her? Moses forgot the law, and all of them broke out in tears, as it is written, and they were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation.
All right, so the idea that Moses's marriage to the daughter of Yitro might have been used against him is being laid out here as being a very public shaming of him. Now, there is a very good explanation, which we've already covered, which is that there is a big difference between Tzipporah and between Cozbi, right? Cozbi was doing this deliberately to seduce us towards idolatry. Tzipporah was instead, as we saw from earlier in the Torah, where she helps Moses to circumcise the kids, she is very much on board with this whole Jewish thing and being part of the nation of Israel. However, Moses, in this moment of shame and humiliation, when it says forgets the law, he can't answer. And so he is reduced to tears. It's up to his grandnephew, Aaron's grandson, Pinchas, to take a spear and finish off Cozbi and Zimri in the act. Okay, but they're upside down. Okay, let's just see a little bit more. This is very interesting analysis by Rabbi Francis Nataf of trying to see parallels between this story and the story of Jacob.
It is difficult to find two more similar stories than the exiles of Yaakov and Moshe. It is equally difficult to find two more disparate parallels than the roles played in these stories by their fathers-in-law. Lavan seems to do something so disagreeable every step of the way, but Yitro does just the opposite, constantly providing help and support. Yaakov has to ask to marry one of Lavan's daughters, whereas Yitro offers Zipporah to Moshe as his bride. Lavan makes the terms of the marriage agreement almost unbearable. In the case of Moshe, we don't hear of any formal terms.
Right. Remember, Moshe showed up penniless as well, and he doesn't get the whole "you'll work 7 years before you marry" and all of that nonsense. It's just, yeah, great. You seem like a good guy, and she seems to like you. My blessing.
When Yaakov asks to leave, we see Lavan repeatedly trying to foil his desires. Regarding Moshe, he is not only given permission, but a blessing. Lavan runs after Yaakov in what could be understood as an effort to kidnap the wives and children, whom Lavan describes as his own. Yitro, on the other hand, runs after Moshe for just the opposite reason, to bring his son-in-law's children and wife back to him.
Right? Rather than trying to steal his wife and kids, he's actually returning them, which is an incredibly gracious act.
Yeah, interesting comparison. Finally, when Lavan catches up with Yaakov, he tries to impose his own religious preferences on his son-in-law, making sure that their non-belligerence pact makes reference to his own God as well as the God of Yaakov. In comparison, when Yitro finds Moshe in the desert, he makes the decision to offer sacrifices to his son-in-law's God alone and to leave sacrifices to his own gods for a more appropriate time.
So, although Rabbi Nataf may or may not, doesn't seem to agree that Yitro had converted by this point, he still realizes that what is happening is still very much in support of the God of Moses and the God of the Israelites. So he's not trying to water down what's happening for the Israelites by interjecting his own God or his own religion into it. He's saying, you know what, you guys, your God, this is amazing, this is great. I only want to join in celebrating. I'm not going to try and co-opt what you're doing. I'm not going to try and usurp what you're doing by adding in my own spin. And again, this is an amazing parallel, just like between Amalek and Yitro, between Yitro and Lavan, of the different types of people there are in the world. And it is all the more pointed when we remember that Yitro was an absolute and complete stranger to Moses, as well as the Israelite people, whereas Lavan was a relative of the Abraham's family, and should have had even more reason to be kind and giving and gracious to Jacob when he showed up. So it is a shame when you can trust a stranger more than you can trust family. But again, it's trying to show that we should not only trust family, because some of them can be rotten, unfortunately, and we shouldn't distrust strangers because some of them can be absolutely amazing. It's almost, again, like it comes down to the individual character more than the collective label. Okay, to come back to Yitro's descendants and how they play out into the rest of Jewish history, we get a couple references.
So Yitro went away to his land to convert the members of his family.
Now, why might we believe that he had converted the members of his family? What other evidence do we have other than the apparent references to his support of God in this particular Torah portion? Well, if you read the next line.
Canaanites are mentioned in Shoftim as well as in Shemuel.
Right, so we get mentioned to the Canaanites as being descended from Moses' father-in-law. And they seem to be living among the children of Israel in the tribal area of the land of Israel during the time of the Judges and the book of Shmuel, the book of Samuel. So there is a feeling that they were no longer Midianites, right? They were not just your regular old Midianites anymore. The Midianites still continue to exist. They were still a nation to the south of Israel, but the Canaanites seem to be allies. They seem to be friends. They are people that Saul goes out of his way to protect. They are people who go out of their way to help us. When in the story of Yael, which we read about just last week in the Haftorah, when we are fighting against Sisera and Yavin, she is there as part of the Canaanite clan to finish the deed of killing the enemy general. So there definitely seems to be some familiarity, some alliance between the Israelites and the Canaanites, the descendants of Jethro. Make sense? Okay, but I wanted to finish off with just one last midrash, which is a little bit off topic, but it still wraps up this idea of Jethro coming to support the Israelite cause and the Israelite God with knowledge. But rather than cutting straight to the end, we got to go through a few other famous people.
4 children of Adam said 4 things.
That means four mortals, right? 4 human beings.
If someone else had said them, they would have laughed at them. And who were they? Moses, Jethro, Solomon, and Nebuchadnezzar. Because it is written in Psalms, he made his ways known to Moses. It is therefore stated in Deuteronomy, the rock. His work is perfect because all his ways are justice.
So let's just make sure we understand why, if anyone else had said all his ways are justice, we would have laughed at him. Because who knows God's ways? I mean, really? Really, you mortal person, you think you know all of God's ways? All of them? Well, if you're Moses, yeah, right? Because we know from the book of Psalms and from many other references that Moses did know God more than any other human being ever would. So therefore, for Moses to make that audacious statement, he gets a pass. The rest of us, we can only quote him. We can't actually say it from our own knowledge.
Then Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, he has made everything beautiful in its time. If someone else had said it, they would have laughed at him, saying, who has made known to this one what is beautiful and what is not beautiful?
Right? I mean, come on. If you're going to categorically say that God has made everything beautiful in its time, what basis of knowledge would you have to make that statement? You know, some peasant living in a hut, you know what everything is and what beauty really is?
But Solomon, whose table lacked nothing, he knew what was beautiful.
And he was speaking from personal experience. As Mel Brooks once said, it's good to be the king, right? He was able to know what was good because he had experienced everything that was good. And therefore, when he says everything is beautiful, he actually has knowledge to back it up.
Nebuchadnezzar said in Dan, all the inhabitants of the earth are of no account. If another had said it, they would have laughed at him. Over what does this man rule? He does not even rule over a gnat. But in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, it was fitting for him to say so.
Right? I mean, can you really put on, airs of grandeur and say, human beings are nothing. They are insignificant to me. It's like, come on, who are you? Nebuchadnezzar, you're the ruler of the largest empire at that time, and you have life or death over thousands and thousands of people. Yeah, the rest of the world probably does look like gnats to you. And now, finally, for our hero of the hour.
So Yitro said in Exodus, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because among all his gods, he did not see one as great as the Lord.
So there are different ways to come to God and to understand God. There is I was born into this, I was raised with this, and this is the greatest thing I've ever known, and I've never really had any doubts or questions about that. And then there are those who may have doubts or questions about it, but they look out at God's creation and they feel a presence of the divine through the world around them that they see, and that reminds them that God is greater than all. Some people will find their connection through other humans and the love that they might feel with other people, the compassion they may feel or may receive from other people, and through that they may recognize the greatness of God's divinity. But there are others, and Yitro is sort of the paradigm of this, who has been around, right? This is somebody who has dallied with every god available, according to this particular midrash. And yet, at the end of the day, after all of their experience with all these other gods, has come to say, this God is the greatest God. Now, that may not sound like a great compliment to Yitro, much like if you were to say, that I think, he's the most handsome guy and I should know because I've slept with them all, would not also be considered high praise. But there is still something very powerful to say he has experienced every other form of religion for his entire world, and he has recognized that this way is a better way to live. That is a very powerful statement of experience leading to wisdom, as opposed to what often happened, which was that type of experience leading to debauchery. And for that, we are trying to remind ourselves of our very first sentence, that if someone shows up and they have been dallying with all this other idolatry, all these other gods, and yet at some point they come to say, you know what, Judaism is good, we don't say, oh, but what would you know? You've been hanging out with all these other gods and you've been doing all this idol worship stuff. No, at this point we say, I'm glad that you have finally recognized it. Welcome to the club. And with that, and the ever-increasing sound of our roof, why don't we go ahead and get out of here before someone falls through? Let me just hit stop and then.
Rabbi.
Watching the video.